Thank you very much for that kind welcome. I've heard much about the Amity campuses over the years and the efforts of Amity University, and it's actually a pleasure to be able to visit at last. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. As you see, people struggle with technology or learn to use technology, and that's really what I want to talk about this morning. Don't want to talk for too long because I want to leave time for questions. And what I'm going to share with you this morning is really some of the research that I've been doing and some of my colleagues have been doing in the field of public diplomacy. So let's start with a few questions. Why is the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Facebook? And he's very pleased to be on Facebook. He's very proud of the fact it's on Facebook. Why is Hillary Clinton on Twitter? Why do some British ambassadors have blogs? We all know what diplomats are like. They're very upright people, they're very serious, and so why are they doing these things? So in this talk I want to engage with what they think they're doing and what they can hope to achieve. And so I want to start by introducing the field of public diplomacy studies and end by offering some answers. And in particular, I want to talk about public diplomacy 2.0. Like everything else in the era of social media, there is public diplomacy 2.0. So let's think about this. But let's start with another question. What do we know about other countries? This is the first time I've been to India. So before I come, I have some ideas about what India is like. How many of you have been to the UK? Okay, some of you. How many of you have been to China? Okay, a few of you. But you may not have been there, but you still have ideas about these countries. And you have to think, well, where do they actually come from? Well, partly they're based on our own experiences. But they're also based on what people tell us. They also are about what we learn from the media. I had a student last year who did some research on the movie Borat. So I don't know if you've come across this one. It's about somebody from Kazakhstan. Now the point is, Borat isn't really from Kazakhstan. The film isn't set in Kazakhstan. Why my student was interested is that the film was made in Romania, and she's Romanian. And so people know this film isn't about Kazakhstan, but when my student went and asked them, what have they learnt about Kazakhstan? They go, there is some element of truth in this movie, even though there's nothing about it. So they think they've learnt something about Kazakhstan from watching Borat. So we are in a situation where we learn about other countries from the media, from random bits of information that we actually have. But these beliefs actually have effects. They have effects on where we want to go on holiday. They have effects on what we buy. And you think it might just affect you. Are you willing to pay more for a German car? Or when you're successful media executives, will you be more likely to buy a Malaysian car or a German car? German, okay. So, these influences don't just affect you or me going on holiday. They actually affect where companies invest. They affect the ability of countries to actually exert influence in the world. If you see a country as corrupt, as oppressive, as unable to offer you anything, well, why should you go along with what they actually want you to do? If, on the other hand, other countries admire you, they respect you, they think you're an example, you're more likely to have influence in the world. And so this leads to a growing interest in this question by governments and academics. And it's formulated in different ways. For instance, in international communications research, people will talk about the national image. In marketing, they will perhaps talk about the national brand, in the same way that you can talk about companies. In international relations, there's the idea of soft power, the idea that countries actually exert influence through people's attraction towards them. And what you then see is that governments are taking growing interest in how they can change the way that people see about them. And this may be in the political sphere, but it's also in the commercial sphere. I watch a lot of CNN at home, and so I know all about various countries that want me to go on holiday there. And I know that India is incredible. Malaysia is truly Asia. Croatia is the Mediterranean as it once was. Montenegro experienced wild beauty. I'm not sure I can find Montenegro on the map, but I know that it's wild beauty if I actually go there. So countries are actually trying to shape the way that they're seen in the world. Now, how you do that, I mean, this isn't a new practice. It's been around for a long time. Some people would argue it goes back to emperors building statues, printing their heads on currencies. It's a way of spreading the image. So it's not new. But of course, the way it's done, it's always been shaped by the media environment. And in the 20th century, from the First World War onwards, there was a huge interest in propaganda, because suddenly the rise of the mass media gave new ways to spread ideas about your country. And so as the media environment changes, the nature of these communication activities change. So we're in a digital media environment, and that is giving rise to new ways of thinking about how we can influence the way that we're actually seen in the world. A few characteristics of this environment. There's more information out there. It can spread more quickly. But the way it behaves is often unpredictable, because information is contained within networks, and these networks interact with each other in a variety of different ways. There are things which, for instance, in India is common knowledge, but in Britain we don't know. But sometimes these pieces of information will suddenly spread from one network to another. The world appears to be more transparent, but there's a lot of information out there that is not hidden, but there is so much information we can't actually find it. So one of the features is what we might call quasi-transparency. Now, from a governmental point of view, this new environment creates both threats and opportunities. Firstly, well, threats. If you have critics, people that don't like you, they have new opportunities to spread information that you don't like. It creates an environment where new groups can actually organize. A lot of excitement in the public diplomacy blogosphere over the last few days. Is Tunisia the new Twitter revolution? New book came out in America by Evgeny Morozov a few weeks ago, attacking the idea that Iran was there was a Twitter revolution in Iran. Also, governments like to be able to tell the story, but as the media environment becomes more fragmented, it's harder for them to get their story across, to actually communicate what they want to do. Also, people have got more opportunity to update their status on Facebook, play Angry Birds, and just generally not pay attention to what the government wants them to pay attention to. On the other hand, there are opportunities. We've got more opportunities to tell our story. If we're Montenegro, which we don't know where it is, we can reach new groups, so that there are people that perhaps we couldn't reach before that we can communicate with. So this new environment creates new opportunities, and this has given rise to this phenomenon of public diplomacy 2.0. partly it comes from the rise of social media, but it also reflects a broader change in thinking about communications, one which we find in public relations, in marketing, as well as in public diplomacy, which is essentially that when we think about communicating, we should think less in terms of sharing information with people, of giving people information, but of actually trying to build relationships with them. That in the end, what people listen to, they listen to people they know, they trust, they care about. And that is more important than actually specific pieces of information. Just bombarding people with more and more information saying we are right won't actually do the job. And so it seemed for many people, both practitioners and scholars in the field of public diplomacy, suddenly we have a new opportunity. That the new social media, your Facebook, your Twitter, the blog, create opportunities for us to really create relationships. Now, what I want to ask in the remainder of this talk is, to what extent is that true? Have we really seen this new dialogical, two-way, relationship-based mode of communications? And if you like, I'm an academic, so I'm paid to be skeptical and miserable about these things, so probably no surprise where I'm going here. So what we've actually seen, looking at the public diplomacy field, is the adoption and promotion of social media platforms. We've seen that governments have, some governments, not all governments, and I'll come to this in a moment, have actually seen that it's important for them to be blogging, to be on Facebook, to actually build up a presence on Twitter. Now, it's interesting, though, that when we begin to compare across countries, that some countries have actually taken this up much more quickly than others. It's been taken up relatively quickly in the UK. In the Foreign Office, ambassadors are encouraged to blog, much to the disgust of some ambassadors, so not all of them will actually do it. But it's felt that by blogging, it gives a face to British diplomacy. It gives opportunities to put the British perspective across. And I was looking yesterday to actually see that I think the British ambassador in the High Commissioner, in Delhi doesn't blog, but the Deputy High Commissioner does. So, but there are differences. For instance, in the German Foreign Ministry, they seem to be very reluctant to embrace these technologies. And we'll think about reasons for that in a moment. We also see that they're taken up in different ways in different countries by the ministries and in embassies. Some countries are very enthusiastic about the technology, others aren't. I think the Americans are outliers in their enthusiasm for the technology. There's some research which shows that the less resources you've got, Montenegro, the more enthusiastic you actually are about new technologies because they create an opportunity for you to spread your message. If you're a country like Montenegro, there's no way you can get media coverage in the UK. Perhaps nobody wants to pay attention to you. So social media are better than nothing. But I think there's two sets of challenges to this. And I think here comes the guitar solo. There's two sets of challenges to this. One at a kind of institutional level, and one at a kind of reception level. And I think these institutional challenges will be very familiar to anyone who's looked at the way that any kind of organization adapts to changes in the media environment. That you have an organization that already exists, and how does it actually incorporate these new technologies into it? For many ministries of foreign affairs, the fact that you have your ambassadors blogging or on Twitter is a nightmare. I mean, who can tell what they'll actually say? I mean, imagine if somebody writes a nasty post on the ambassador's blog and he goes mad and he just tells them what he really thinks. that governments have spent a lot of time trying to tell a consistent story. And social media means you actually have to decentralize and trust people to stay, if you like, on message, as we'd say in the UK. And so some foreign ministries have a very restrictive policy. I think the German foreign ministry is very conservative about these things. Other foreign ministries are much more relaxed. Some countries allow you to blog or to operate in the social media environment, but require you to clear the message. And as I was flying to India on the plane, I was reading a new paper from the United States, which was studying the work of the digital outreach team at the State Department. And their job is to go onto discussion boards where people are being rude about America and correct their misunderstandings, particularly, and they focus on sort of Arabic language social media fora. But this group, every time they write a post, they have to check with each other, check that it's okay. So it was calculated it takes them an average of 2.77 days, which I guess is nearly 3 days, to actually respond. So in terms of having an ongoing interactive dialogue, this is not really very effective. This study, interesting enough, also found that when these people intervened, all the subsequent comments were much more negative than they had been before. So some people don't want to do it, some people will do it, but they're again concerned with saying the wrong thing, and which tends to undermine the effectiveness. Another point which affects all public diplomacy work is resources. If you want to build relationships with people, it's time-consuming. In the social network literature, one of the points that is made, which is a bit surprising for people brought up on reading about how technology is going to transform the world, is it says, remember, to have a relationship imposes a cost. You have obligations to other people, so that actually relationships aren't free. If you're building relationships with one group of people, it limits your ability to build relationships with other groups of people. So there's perhaps a problem with the broader paradigm. Resources, of course, never fit the problem. Public diplomacy, it's always argued, means that if we can persuade people to agree with our policies, to like our countries better, it can have huge but intangible advantages. And in a world of budgets and arguing for budgets, how do you demonstrate the effectiveness? How do you demonstrate value for money? It's hard. And I referred before to the outreach team at the State Department. Consists of 10 people. How big is the Arabic blogosphere? That is, we're dealing with thousands of forums. We're having 10 people who have holidays and don't work weekends. So that the idea is nice, but the actual scale of the resource available seems to me very, very, very limited. And if we actually look at what goes on in many embassies, social media activities depend on one person who started this as an initiative. They pursue it, but of course they work in a foreign ministry, and every 3 years or so they get rotated to another job, and somebody else comes along. There's no money for it, there's nothing in the workload model, it's not in their assessment, so they don't do it. So people start building relationships, and then it just goes. And then there are some strategic questions. Should we centralize? Should we run our communications out to the foreign ministry, or should we try and localize? This is a difficult question which is always resolved in different ways in different countries. And then there's questions about impact. How do we measure effects? And I've touched on this already. Very big problem in public diplomacy. Conference coming up where there's going to be a lot of discussion about this. What is best practice? How can we actually do it? Of course, this is the same question that you find in advertising. 90% of advertising budget is wasted, but we don't know which 90%. And public diplomacy, the problem is even worse, because at least with advertising, you know if people buy your product or not. It's easy to study what governments do. You can see what gets posted, how active they are. It's much harder to evaluate what this really means in the real world. And of course, who engages with you? If you actually go onto governmental Facebook pages, you're going to discover that there's two kinds of people who are commenting. The people who already agree with what you're doing, or the people who really don't agree with what you're doing. And you're probably not actually having that much of an influence on either of them. And so then you have to ask the question, are we really spending our money, putting our effort in the right place? I have a sneaking suspicion that part of what's driven the take-up of this technology is the desire to appear modern. Okay, and this is, the country that I particularly have in mind is the UK. And I think there's an element there of trying to appear hip and trendy. Although if I express that view to some people at the Foreign Office, some of them will say this is completely wrong, whereas some of them will go, yes. A few conclusions. Public diplomacy is a growth area. It's an expanding area of activity and an expanding area of research. The media environment that's changing offers countries new opportunities to promote themselves. And I know that in India, there's been a lot of interest in the last few months over how India can actually shape its image in the world. There was a big conference with some of my colleagues from USC here before in December, and people like Sashi Tharoor have actually been doing a lot of work to try and promote this idea. So there's opportunities from the new environment, but it's not just countries like China or Brazil or India who are beginning to invest in this area. For say, countries in Africa, public diplomacy is seen as a way of changing their image. One of the problems that African countries have is brand Africa. What do we know about Africa? Well, it's full of starving babies. From the top to the bottom, all the same. And for African country, and this brand, of course, is promoted by the aid industry. That people like Bono have a certain interest in actually in mobilizing support for Africa. They inadvertently make Africa look bad. And this was summed up to me a few years ago by a Nigerian student I had who was very cross. She was arguing with the students in her class because they had this very negative image of Africa. And she turned round to them and she just said, I remember this years later, she said, in Lagos, we have traffic jams on the flyovers. And in terms of this room full of British students who actually saw Africa as mud huts and starving babies, this, I think, really made a strong impression. So you discover countries like Ghana, Kenya are actually developing their own public diplomacy programs because they want to try and control their image and not have it shaped for them. So PD 2.0, I think, is a part of this, but we need to appreciate the limitations. How do you incorporate this into the broader practice of diplomacy? And that's challenging. I think ministries of foreign affairs need to learn about how that's done. That's true of many, many organizations. You also have to think that the ideas of social networks are actually older than social networking technology. And this actually tells you that in the end, public diplomacy is about relationships with people. The technology may facilitate it, it may change those relationships, but the technology itself is not the magic bullet. Thank you.